Welcome aboard. Welcome to another tour. Today we are at the Columbus-Lowndes County Airport in Columbus, Mississippi. On September 19th, 1973, Jim Croce, the singer-songwriter, played here at the Whitfield Auditorium at the Mississippi State College for Women. His next stop on the tour would be a show on September 20th, 1973 at the Northwestern State University's Prather Coliseum in Natchitoches, Louisiana. That would be his final show before a tragic plane crash would take his life. Today, we're going to talk about Jim Croce, his rapid rise to fame, and the events leading up to this tragic event. Today, we are in the Beechcraft Model 18, also known as the Twin Beech. This is the model aircraft that Jim Croce was in 1973. Just as a reminder, recreating any actual flight conditions or simulating the crash is not what we do here. We just talk about the backstory leading up to the events, and we find some of the locations here in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I originally made this flight in the Cessna Grand Caravan, and then the next day, Microsoft Flight Simulator added the Beechcraft Model 18, so I had to refly it in that. I am not very familiar with the Beechcraft Model 18 and have very little time in it, but will manage. Let me get the aircraft started, get the cockpit set up, and then we can take a look at our flight plan while we taxi. If this is your first tour, welcome. As I said, what we do here is we find interesting stories or events and we discuss them while flying to some of the associated locations here in Flight Simulator.
Kilo Uniform Bravo Sierra Traffic Dude 7 Tree is taxiing to runway tree 6.
The plane is started. Let's take a look at today's flight plan while we start our taxi to the runway. We are at Columbus-Lowndes County Airport, which has the airport code KUBS. The airport is located about 3 miles southeast of Columbus, Mississippi. The runway here is runway 1836 and is 4,503 feet long, or 1,373 meters. Our destination today is Natchitoches Regional Airport, located 2 miles south of Natchitoches, Louisiana. This is where the accident occurred that took the life of Jim Croce and 5 others. James Joseph Croce was an American folk and rock singer-songwriter. Jim was born January 10, 1943 in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to the parents James Albert Croce and Flora Mary Croce. He grew up in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia, and attended Upper Darby High School. We are at the hold short line. All right, let's fly.
Kilo Uniform Bravo Sierra Traffic Dude 7 Tree taking off runway tree 6 departing straight out.
We Are Airborne. After graduating high school in 1960, he studied at Malvern Preparatory School for a year before enrolling at Villanova University, where he majored in psychology. In his sophomore year, Jim and his good friend Mike DiBenedetto auditioned to become disc jockeys at the school radio station. The music producer at the time was Tommy Picardo, who became known professionally as Tommy West. Tommy would go on to be an American record producer and singer-songwriter. Jim became a student disc jockey at the station at the time, WKVU. As we leave the Columbus airport here, the first site where we'll be flying over is the Whitfield Auditorium, which is at the Mississippi State College for Women. I believe now it's also referred to as the Rent Auditorium. At the urging of Tommy, who was the Glee Club conductor, Jim became a member of the Villanova Spires. The Spires were a group that performed folk songs. The Spires also played under the name the Coventry Lads when they were playing off-campus. In addition to performing with the Spires, Jim performed a few different bands of his own and performed at fraternity parties, coffee houses, and universities all around Philadelphia. Another of Jim's friends from his time at Villanova was Joe Saldiola, also known as Sal, and he would become Jim's producer as well as close friend. In 1963, Jim's friend, Tommy West, had graduated from Villanova and was working as a radio announcer and music director with the radio station WRLB-FM in Long Branch, New Jersey. After a few years there, Tommy left the station to work for ABC Records in New York City. Soon after that, he met fellow songwriter Terry Cashman and George Pistelli. Tommy became a session singer and sang backup vocals on albums by Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Sammy Davis Jr., Connie Francis, and many others. Tommy would go on to play a crucial role in Jim's career. Jim graduated Villanova in 1965. Jim met his wife Ingrid Jacobson during a hootenanny, which is an informal gathering where folk music is played. The hootenanny was held at the Philadelphia Convention Hall. It was the largest festival of the year, showcasing folk groups from over 50 universities and high schools. Jim was judging the contest as well as being a member of the Coventry Lads. Ingrid was playing with a 4-member band called the Rum Runners. After meeting Ingrid, Jim asked her if she would stay and play some music with him after the contest. They hit it off and soon became a couple. Jim and Ingrid were married in 1966. A week after the two were married, Jim enlisted in the Army National Guard to avoid being drafted during the Vietnam War. Jim had a little trouble with authority and had to go through basic training twice, once at Fort Jackson in South Carolina and once at Fort Dix in New Jersey. Jim later summed up his military service by saying that if there's ever a war where we have to defend ourselves with mops, we'll be well prepared. Jim released his first album, Facets, in 1966 with 500 copies he had pressed himself. The album had been financed with a $500 wedding gift from Jim's parents, who set a condition that the money must be spent to make the album. They hoped that he'd give up music after the album failed and use his college education to pursue a more respectable profession. However, unexpectedly, it proved to be a success. Jim sold every record, even turning a profit of $2,500. The majority of those records were sold to fans who attended Jim's shows at local bars. During this time, Jim got his first long-term gig at a suburban bar and steakhouse in Lima, Pennsylvania called the Riddle Paddock. His set list covered several genres including blues, country, rock and roll, and folk. Jim had a loyal following and was also working various jobs to earn additional money. Jim and Ingrid also started to perform as a duo. In 1968, the Croces were encouraged by friend and record producer Tommy West to move to New York City. With Tommy West and Terry Cashman as their producers, Capitol Records signed the Croces. The couple recorded their first album, Approaching Day, with Capitol Records. The album would also be released under the title Croce or Jim and Ingrid Croce. When the record failed to generate much interest or sales, the Croces were dropped from their recording contract. During the next 2 years, they drove more than 300,000 miles, playing small clubs and concerts on college campuses, promoting their album. Becoming disillusioned by the music business and New York City, they sold all but one guitar to pay the rent and returned to the Pennsylvania countryside, settling into an old farm in Lindell. Back in Pennsylvania, Jim was forced to take on odd jobs such as driving a truck, construction work, and welding just to pay the bills. Jim described it as him deciding to be serious about becoming a productive member of society. He continued to write songs, often about the characters he would meet at the local bars and truck stops and his experiences at work. Jim had a knack for tucking away information and experiences. This was a key ingredient in the songs Jim would go on to write. Although Jim and Ingrid weren't making much money in the music business, they had quite a reputation for throwing a good party at their rented farmhouse. Jim and Ingrid's guests included Arlo Guthrie, Cheech Marin of the comedy duo Cheech and Chong, Bonnie Raitt, James Taylor, Jimmy Buffett, as well as Randy Newman. In 1970, Jim met classically trained pianist-guitarist and singer-songwriter Maury Muehleisen from Trenton, New Jersey. He met Maury through his friend and producer Joe Salviolo. Sal had met Maury when he was teaching at Glassboro State College in New Jersey. Sal brought Jim and Maury together at the production office of Tommy West and Terry Cashman in New York City. Terry Cashman was the lead singer for a band called the Chevrons in the late 1950s through the early 1960s. He also played minor league baseball in the Detroit Tigers organization around that same time. In 1967, Cashman teamed up with Gene Pistelli and Tommy West to form the pop-folk group Cashman, Pistelli, and West. They later would record under the name the Buchanan Brothers. Jim, at first, backed Maury on guitar, while Maury was promoting his Capitol Records released album Gingerbread. But gradually their roles reversed, with Maury adding lead guitar to Jim's music. When Jim and Ingrid discovered they were going to have a child, Jim became more determined to make music his profession. He would now have a family to support, and he knew it was now or never. Jim sat at the kitchen table and went to work, writing almost non-stop for the next week. Pulling from those experiences Jim had tucked away, he wrote some of his future hits. The song Rapid Roy was written from his experiences at a racetrack in Reading, Pennsylvania, where he would go on Sundays to view the stock car races. Bad Leroy Brown was the character Jim had met while serving in the Army National Guard at Fort Jackson. Roller Derby Queen is a song that actually came to Jim while performing in Texas. As Jim told it, he was up on stage one night, and after every song this lady down front would raise her arms up high in the air and applaud. Well, Jim noticed that when she applauded with her arms up in the air, her arm muscles would just flap back and forth, and Jim kinda got a kick out of this. After meeting her, it turned out that she was a roller derby queen who performed on the roller derby circuit throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. He wrote the song Roller Derby Queen in her honor. You Don't Mess Around with Jim came from a time Jim had been thrown out of a pool tournament. He had been thrown down a flight of stairs by the pool room bouncer. Operator came from his boot camp days. He stated that dozens of soldiers would be waiting in line every night for the one payphone, and man, the stories you would hear while waiting in that line. The heartbreak of the guys getting dumped over the phone. Could you help me place this? While Jim was working odd jobs, he had once taken a job at a car wash for a time, and that explains working at the car wash blues.
Story about a guy that thinks he should be ruling the universe somewhere, but he's really working at a car wash. The title's really a long one. It's called I Goddamn Steadily Depressing, Low Down Mind Messing, Working at the Car Wash Blues. When I had just got out from the county prison, doing 90 days for non-support.
According to Ingrid, Jim wanted to get off the road. And one night, they sat in the bedroom discussing their future, and how she was upset at Jim, never being home and making no money. A small argument ensued, and Jim left the room while Ingrid just lay in bed crying. Jim went down to the kitchen table where he often sat and played his guitar, and he wrote songs. The next morning, Jim returned to the bedroom with his guitar in hand and told Ingrid to listen to his song, I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song. The song, Time in a Bottle, was a song he wrote upon learning that Ingrid was pregnant with their son, AJ. Jim sent a cassette of his new songs to Tommy in New York City in the hope that he could once again attempt a successful record deal. By the summer of 1971, Jim was working a jackhammer for Sweeney Construction and patiently waiting for a record deal to come to fruition from Tommy's efforts in New York City. Their son, Adrian James, or AJ, was born in September of 1971. Ingrid became a stay-at-home mom while Jim worked and promoted his new music. Tommy West and Jim's manager Elliot Abbott finally secured a record deal with ABC Dunhill Records in 1972. When Jim signed to ABC, Terry Cashman and Tommy West resumed production duties for his albums, releasing 2 albums, You Don't Mess Around with Jim and Life and Times. The singles You Don't Mess Around with Jim, Operator, and Time in a Bottle all received substantial airplay. Also that year, the Croce family moved to San Diego, California. In 1972, Jim began appearing on television, including his national debut on American Bandstand on August 12th, The Tonight Show on August 14th, and The Dick Cavett Show on September 20th and 21st. Jim began touring the United States with Maury, performing in large coffee houses, college campuses, and at folk festivals. However, his financial situation remained precarious. The record company had fronted him the money to record, and much of his earnings now went to repay that advance. In February of 1973, Jim and Maury traveled to Europe, performing in London, Paris, Amsterdam, Monte Carlo, Zurich, and Dublin to positive reviews. Jim made television appearances on the Midnight Special, which he co-hosted on June 15th, The Helen Reddy Show on July 19th. Croce's biggest single, Bad Bad Leroy Brown, reached #1 on the American charts in July. From July 16th through August 4th, Jim and Maury returned to London and performed on the Old Grey Whistle Test, which was a British television music show where they sang Lover's Cross and Workin' at the Car Wash Blues from their upcoming album, I Got a Name. Jim was nearing the end of their grueling European and U.S. tour when he had a date to play a concert in a small college town in Natchitoches, Louisiana, on the campus of Northwestern State University. On September 19, 1973, Jim played at the Whitfield Auditorium in Columbus, Mississippi, and on September 20th, moved on to play at Prather Coliseum in Natchitoches, Louisiana. His next scheduled stop after that would be on September 21st at Austin College in Sherman, Texas. The flight from Mississippi to Louisiana was one leg and a flight arranged on September 18th with Bill Breedlove, the director of operations of Mustang Aviation, who had entered into agreement with Lloyd St. Martin of Variety Artists, the booking agency, for the tour to provide an aircraft to fly Jim Croce and the group from Shawnee, Oklahoma, to Columbus, Mississippi, and then to Natchitoches, and then to Dallas. The agreed-upon fee was $952.63. Later that day, Mr. Breedlove learned that the aircraft he had planned to use to transport the group was disabled. He contacted John Roberts of Roberts Airways, who agreed to provide a Roberts Airways plane and pilot to fly the charter for Mustang Aviation. It was the Roberts Airways plane, a Beechcraft E-18S, registration number N50JR, flown by pilot Robert N. Elliott, that made the scheduled flight. As I mentioned, the aircraft was a Beechcraft Model 18, or Twin Beech, and is a twin-engined low-wing aircraft. Their arrival, Natchitoches, was described in the book I Got a Name, the Jim Croce story. "Hey, Maury," Jim called over his left shoulder to his friend and guitar player. "Watch this. Bob's going to let me land the plane. Do you think you're ready?" asked Maury. "Is the Pope Catholic?" replied Jim. Robert Elliott, the pilot, instructed Jim to increase the flaps to 10 degrees and to watch his airspeed. From that co-pilot seat of this private plane, Jim looked down on the old plantation city in Louisiana, perched on the grassy banks of the Crane River. With the heat waves rising from the runway and with the pilot's help, Jim angled down over a sparse strand of pecan trees and set the twin-engine Beechcraft onto the runway. The flying lessons may have been helping break up the monotony of the tour, but Ingrid said Jim was exhausted. This was his 4th concert in 4 days. In discussing the stress of the current tour, Jim had told Ingrid, "If I don't stop this craziness myself, something else will." The tour was taking its toll on Maury as well. He had been by Jim's side for the past 2 years. Jim and Maury performed after the comedian George Stevens had opened the show for the musicians at the Prather Coliseum that night, September 20th, 1973. This concert was actually a rescheduled date. The concert was originally to be held earlier that year, but Jim had suffered some throat issues, and it caused it to be rescheduled. Since the original date, though, Jim's first album, Don't Mess Around with Jim, had rocketed to the top of the charts, and his second was on the way up the charts. At this time, Jim's fee for a concert date was fairly high, and the promoters for this rescheduled show had a real bargain on their hands. The current fee was $10,000, and the fee when this date was booked before Jim's recent success was only $750. Jerry Pierce, Vice President of External Affairs at Northwestern and an assistant professor of journalism back in 1973, was director of the university's news bureau, and he attended the concert with his son. Pierce said the cost in total to put on that concert was around $4,000. Jim and Maury spent the evening performing some of the greatest hits of Jim's very short career, and also played his upcoming release, I Got a Name. In true Jim fashion, he told the story behind this brand new song, as he often did. I Got a Name was deeply personal to Jim. He was fiercely proud of his upbringing and especially his father. He wrote this song about his father's dreams for him in dying before seeing his son's first real success.
Like a singing bird and the croaking toad, I got a name.
The group was originally planning to spend the night in Natchitoches, but at some point Jim had made the decision to leave that night, and they called the pilot, who was staying at the Lakeview Motel, to depart early. They were planning on flying to Sherman, Texas for a concert at Austin College. No one really knew why Jim wanted to make that early exit, but a letter from Jim sent to Ingrid just before his death shows that Jim was growing weary of the road and was missing his family, which included the couple's 1-year-old son, AJ. According to Ingrid, Jim at the time was also very frustrated that he essentially had been receiving no royalties from his recent success. That claim is denied by Philip Kernet, Tommy West, and Terry Cashman, who were all involved in the contract Jim had signed in 1968 with Blending Well Music. Essentially, at this point in the tour, Jim was physically exhausted, homesick, and felt his marriage was at risk, all because of this endless touring. Ingrid received a letter Jim wrote a week after his death. In it, he spoke of his desire to reconnect with his wife and son and perhaps quit the music business altogether, becoming what he called a public hermit. Jim's letter closes with, "When I get back, everything will be different. We're going to have a life together. Ing, I promise. I'm going to concentrate on my health. I'm going to become a public hermit. I'm going to get my master's degree. I'm going to write short stories and movie scripts. Who knows? I might even get a tan. Give a kiss to my little man and tell him Daddy loves him. Remember, it's the first 60 years that count, and I've got 30 to go. I love you, Jim." We are approaching the area near Natchitoches, where we're going to find the Northwestern State University and the Prather Coliseum, which was the site of Jim Croce's last concert. After being called, the pilot Bob Elliott had to walk or run most of the way to the airport. He had tried to call a taxi, but there weren't any taxis in Natchitoches at the time. Bob had actually got lost and at around 10 p.m. had stopped at the police station to get directions to the airport. He was met at the door by Lieutenant Winbarg, who was on his way out to a narcotics stakeout. Encountering this disheveled man at the door, Bob explained he was a pilot and trying to find the airport. The lieutenant gave him directions, telling him the airport is south and about 3 miles. He did, however, seriously doubt the guy's story. Lieutenant Winbarg then left and met up with Police Chief Harry Hyams, and he relayed his story about the disoriented guy in a wrinkled white shirt and dark blue pants claiming to be a pilot. They both surmised he may be a possible suspect in the stakeout they were conducting. Ironically, a short time later, Bob Elliott actually jogged by the police officers. This time they stopped him and investigated a bit further. Since Bob Elliott claimed to have left his ID in the plane, the police chief fully believed that this story would turn out to be fabricated. The chief chuckled and said, "Well, let's just head on over to the airfield and you can show it to me." Arriving at the airport, the chief was more than surprised to find a group standing at the aircraft. Asking the group if they knew the individual in the police car, the tour manager, Morgan Tell, looked into the car and said, "Yep, that's our pilot." The chief said, "Well, he managed to get himself lost here in our big metropolis. I sure hope he has better luck navigating your plane." By the time Bob Elliott made it to the airport, others claimed he looked completely exhausted. He was 2 weeks shy of turning 58 and had suffered a heart attack just 5 months earlier. Retracing the route he would have taken on foot from the Lakeview Motel to the airport that night was about 3 miles. At one point, he got lost, turned around, and went through an entire cornfield before being spotted and picked up by the police chief. Now with their pilot, the group was ready to depart. Maury climbed into the Beechcraft and sat in the back seat opposite Ken Cortez, while George Stevens and Dennis Rast, also known by his on-air DJ name Morgan Tell, took the 2 seats across the aisle. Bob Elliott started his pre-flight checks and Jim took the co-pilot seat. Elliott piloted the plane down the runway and took off, but barely became airborne when the twin-engine Beechcraft clipped a pecan tree just off the end of the runway and crashed near the Highway 1 bypass, killing all the passengers instantly.
Kilo India Echo Romeo traffic dude 7 tree is on downwind runway tree 5.
Now let's make our way back to the airport and get the aircraft back on the ground, and we will take a look around the airport where this crash occurred. Dan McDonald, who was a Northwestern State sophomore and a reporter for the student newspaper, was at the scene after the crash. He says, "I saw the flashing lights everywhere. I figured a plane had gone down, and it wasn't hard to figure out whose plane it was. I'd never seen anything like that. It almost looked like a bomb had hit the plane. The debris field gave me an idea of how forceful the crash was."
Kilo India Echo Romeo traffic dude 7 tree is on base runway tree 5.
At 4:30 a.m., Ingrid received a call from her stepmother, asking her if she was all right. And she said, "Yeah, why?" She said, "I was watching the Today Show. There's been a plane crash." And Ingrid immediately responded, "Jim's dead, isn't he?" The day after the crash, Jim's single "I Got a Name" was released as had been planned and became a top 10 hit. Time in a Bottle was re-released, and by the end of 1973, it topped the charts.
Kilo India Echo Romeo traffic dude 7 tree is on final runway tree 5 to land.
It was only the third posthumous #1 single of the era. Otis Redding's "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay" and Janis Joplin's "Me and Bobby McGee" were the other 2. An investigation by the NTSB named the probable cause as the pilot's failure to see the obstruction due to physical impairment and because fog reduced his vision. The 57-year-old pilot suffered from severe coronary artery disease and had run 3 miles to the airport from a motel. The pilot had 14,290 hours total flight time and 2,190 hours in that Beechcraft 18 type airplane. A later investigation would place the blame on pilot error because of his downwind takeoff into what they described as a black hole of severe darkness, limiting his use of visual references. During a downwind departure, a higher ground speed is needed to take off, and therefore a longer runway is required, and the climb-out angle is lower due to the tailwind. Normally, you want to take off into the wind or with a headwind. When taking off with a headwind, it slows down the plane in its acceleration in respect to the ground, but it increases the flow of air over the wings, generating lift, allowing it to take off in shorter distances and climbing at a greater angle in order to clear any obstacles. Jim Croce, at the time of the crash, was 30 years old. We are on the ground here at Natchitoches Regional Airport. The end of the runway here is where that plane hit a tree during takeoff, resulting in the crash. Others lost in the crash were pilot Robert Elliott, Croce's bandmate Maury Muehleisen, comedian George Stevens, manager and booking agent Kenneth Cortez, and road manager Dennis Rast. AJ, Jim's son, was a week away from his 2nd birthday at the time. Jim Croce was buried at the Chaim Solomon Memorial Park in Fraser, Pennsylvania. Years later, when Ingrid Croce visited Natchitoches and the Northwestern University, the then mayor Joe Sampite made a point to tell her, "I just want you to know we cut that damn tree down." That is a bit about Jim Croce and the tragic event that took place here in 1973. The price of today's tour is pretty reasonable. If you could just reach down and hit that subscribe button, I really appreciate it, and it does help the channel a lot. Let's find a place to park the aircraft, and we'll send up the drone, take a look around the airport here. The album, I Got a Name, was released on December 1st, 1973. The posthumous release included hits like Workin' at the Car Wash Blues and I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song. The album reached number 2, and I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song reached number 9 on the singles chart. Jim Croce's untimely death gave his lyrics in the song Time in a Bottle, dealing with mortality and the wish to have more time, much more meaning. When it was eventually released as a single, it became his 2nd and final number 1 hit. After the single had finished its 2-week run at the top in early January 1974, the album You Don't Mess Around with Jim was number 1 for 5 weeks. The Croce's son, Adrian James or AJ Croce, who was born on September 28, 1971, went on to also become a successful singer-songwriter.